All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to be doing a reading for grad school, and I thought I'd make it easily accessible to everybody. I actually do have the software available through my institution that I will be using to share the reading with you for one, and then for two, so you can see what I'm reading. I actually already read the abstract here, but it was muted. Or my microphone just wasn't picking it up when I tried to do a YouTube recording. So I'm going to just reread through it one more time. And I might pause it here and there just to catch my breath or take some notes. But for the most part, this is just going to be a straight through reading. So this is Queering the Archive, Transforming the Archival Process by Lizeth Zepeda from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. The purpose of this work is to recognize the lack of queer of color lens within the archival profession that determines the appraisal, preservation, and impeding access. I'm going to blow this up a little bit just so it's easier for me to see and easier for you to see, I guess. Can even zoom in a little more. Too much. Okay. So, queering the archive transforms the institution with possibilities of inclusivity for social justice and the rewriting of histories. Traditionally, the archival institution has reaffirmed hegemonic power structures by erasing and ignoring histories of marginalized communities. A way to disrupt this is to queer these archival institutions to confront these power dynamics and make interventions against the racist, sexist, classist, and heterosexist structures that maintain them. Thus, this paper focuses on how processing through a queer of color lens can transform archival institutions by contextualizing and uncovering erased archival histories. Specifically, I will discuss the Sarah S Valencia collection, a manuscript collection of a Mexican-American woman and her family dating back to the 1860s in Tucson, Arizona. As a queer Chicana feminist archivist with a queer of color lens, I read many of the contents of the archive differently. Through a visual representation of photographs, a seemingly heterosexual woman shows moments of queerness that could have only been discovered through a queer of color lens. All right, so hegemony, I don't want to misquote it here, but just to elaborate, leadership predominance by one country or a social group over others. In communication, we use this term to talk about this is just the way things are, and people can actively consent to that and not realize it. So let's move on. Queering the archive changes how we define lives and allows for infinite possibilities of inclusivity for social justice and reframing of history. Some archivists have a difficult time with the concept of what queering can mean because it disrupts the fundamentals of what processing archival collections represents. Traditionally, in theory, processing remains neutral and unbiased to allow for future research to interpret the collections. This stance on neutrality reinforces marginalization for those that are deemed queer to society. By adding a queer of color lens while processing archival collections, one will be able to change traditional structures and make interventions against racist, sexist, classist, and heterosexist systems that maintain them. Queerness is complex and is often not expressed explicitly in communities of color or in general. In other words, there are factors at play that can inhibit someone from expressing their desires or gender identity. Hence, a queer of color lens is crucial for an archivist to participate in the contextualization of materials for a more adequate documentation of those communities that have been underdocumented. This paper focuses on how queer of color lens in processing archival collections can transform archival institutions by contextualizing and uncovering erased archival histories. Specifically, I will address the Sarah S. Valencia collection housed at the Arizona Historical Society in Tucson, Arizona. Sarah Valencia was a Mexican-American woman who lived in Tucson where her family history dates back to the 1860s, shortly after the Gadsden Purchase that ceded control of southern Arizona from Mexico to the United States. Queer of color lens in processing archival materials. When actively describing materials and collecting people's past experiences, biases will nevertheless be present. There's a need to have a deep reflection and acknowledgement of who is being excluded from these narratives. With a queer of color lens, archival materials can be a site to dismantle white supremacist and heteropatriarchal structures in the archive. Queer is a complex theoretical framework that can take up many shapes. Queer theorist Nikki Sullivan states, queer is a positionality rather than an innate identity. That potentiality can be taken up by any who feels themselves to have been marginalized as a result of their preference. Then one might argue that the majority of the world's population is, at least potentially, queer. So this is sort of saying that queerness isn't innate, that it can ebb and flow and that it can change depending on the circumstances, at least as I understand it. So their argument is people feeling marginalized are queer people, is my understanding of it, but I could be wrong there. The act of queering is to actively complicate traditional notions of how stories are told and documented. Patrick Stjorn, 2012, suggests going beyond homosexuality or queer in databases because one will not find hits using these terms, but instead to look into contextual research in places that could be read as queer. Stjorn also brings up a reminder that the term queer was coined to destabilize homogenous identity categories. So to insert it as a static label in a museum, or in this case, archival database, would be to work against its disruptive power. So yeah, the whole point of queer is that there's binaries. There's like male, female, straight, gay, white, black. Queering is just sort of looking at it in terms of saying this isn't just this or that. It's a spectrum and it's very complicated. So queer isn't like, it's not become a trinary now. It's not like it's straight and then gay and then queer. It's not like a sexual identity. It's not a position. It's a way of looking at things from a different point of view. So categorization and cataloging are problematic because they contribute to providing access in the archival field. Queer theory provides the tools to rethink this presumption. So, all right. I was trying to just pause the recording, but I don't know if I can. Oh, I can. Alt P. Ooh, good to know. Anyway, I think I might do that right now. It didn't work. Alt P. Okay. Alt P apparently, but you have to click up here at the top beforehand. So Roderick Ferguson, 2004, for instance, defines a queer of color analysis as interrogating the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and class with particular interest in how those formations correspond with and diverge from nationalist ideals and practices. In his book, Aberrations in Black, Towards a Queer of Color Critique, he begins with a description of a photograph he found in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. He painstakingly describes the photograph taken in 1938 of 4 men at a railroad station in Jim Crow, Manchester, Georgia. These photographs are undoubtedly part of the nation's memory, but Ferguson affirms, I know as well that there are subjects missing who would be accounted for. The transgender men who worked at Levi's and wore a baseball cap and chewed tobacco. The men with long permed hair who tickled pianos. The sissies and bulldaggers who taught the neighborhood children to say their speeches on Easter Sunday morning. These stories are hidden between the lines in these collections. However, archivists do not necessarily have the tools to identify them. Ferguson's account significantly contributes to thinking about how to queer archives, specifically looking between lines for clues, adding historical and personal context, as well as contesting heterosexuality as default, even when there are hints to suggest other possibilities. So it's not just being straight. There's many other things you can be too. Sarah S. Valencia collection. Using the tools provided by queer scholars and interpreting the lens through a queer of color critique is putting theory into practice and processing archival collections. Within archival institutions, archivists are forced to follow and reinforce a culture of neutrality, access, and preservation at the center of their work. To counter this, Elizabeth Kaplan states, the archival record does not just happen, it is created by individuals and organizations, and used in turn to support their values and mission, all of which comprises a process that is certainly not politically and culturally neutral. I'm going to pause it here and take that quote. I just went off. I just talked a whole lot about in 208 words. I took that quote and I just sort of put some context around it. The College of Arts and Sciences used to be, well, still is referred to as McMicken Hall, but people don't like to call it that anymore because, here we go, newsrecord.org, the rise and fall of McMicken Hall, all that sort of stuff. All you need to know is that UC studied into him and they wanted to change it. They never did. Yeah, it never changed. It just seems to be more of a discourse thing. Limitations give freedom. Let me see here. The scope of the study was conducted, never included looking into the name of the building, only the academic entity, according to the book's report. So let me actually pull up the study from Charles McMicken. Formal group, input from students, faculty, and staff. That the commission would study the use of McMicken's name, working group co-chairs, dean emeritus of the college, only to examine the use of McMicken's name in the College of Arts and Sciences. What the president had asked us to do is to try and take on the question of the college's name, provide the best recommendation with the best thought process we can devise on that score. Same University did set a deadline for the group to issue a final report. Undergraduate student body president and third-year political science student said McMicken's name is so deeply ingrained in every part of the university that removing his name from the college wouldn't erase anything. I look at it through the context as a current student in the college of reaffirming our university's values and commitment to students of color and students who have identified that Charles McMicken didn't necessarily want to be here or didn't found our university for. So I'm trying to find the information. Charles Frederick Casey Langenher, much of the wealth in the U.S. comes from slavery. Removing the name would not change the history of how the university was founded. No historian that I know wants to erase history by removing the names of slaveholders from institutions. Second-year organizational leadership students said changing the name would remove a daily reminder of the nation's history for slavery. The effect of slavery is still prevalent today, and we are in this a great situation right now where we can change how the past affected our future. So, yeah. What I put here, because I remember hearing this in person, not necessarily reading about it, was that Charles McMicken wanted to create this institution for white students and not for students of color. So that was just sort of like, we're talking about archives, not in the traditional sense as being brick and mortar buildings that have things inside of them, but in this case, I believe McMicken Hall is an example of an archive where it's trying at face value to be like, oh, we care about all of our students equally. But at the same time, they really don't, because if they did, then maybe the name of this college would be changed to someone else who didn't have this idea of, like, it seems like in the archive, just because you pay a certain amount of money, then your work will be out there. You know what I mean? But like, that's elitist at its core of being like, the only reason it's there is because someone paid for it to be here. That's no different than what Charles McMicken did, is like, here's $1 million, but I want to educate white kids, you know? So obviously times change, and now our student body is 24% non-white, which is great, but it's not enough, I don't think. Until students of color become the majority, then I don't really see any reason to celebrate. So, especially when this is still called the PWI, predominantly white institution. So I'm going to get back to reading. Sorry for my tangent. Stating that biases are not present in the collecting process of archival materials by the collectors is putting too much faith in an individual. Archivists should instead be conscious of this and participate in the interpretation of these materials. In the Arizona Archive Matrix was a project carried out by archival repositories, which created inventories and surveyed what was collected in the state of Arizona. 15 archival repositories participated in the project, and in 2012, it was discovered that there were only 4 archival collections identified statewide as LGBTQIA. The statistics of how many collections are considered LGBTQIA in Arizona is alarming. The Arizona Historical Society has only 1 collection identified as LGBT, and the majority of the materials are periodicals from various parts of Arizona. Some topics include same-sex marriage, HIV/AIDS, and the different organizations around Southern Arizona dating from 1991 to 2010. These periodicals and newspaper clippings tell an important history of LGBT communities in Arizona, but the documentation of these communities continues to be a small percentage. With such a massive backlog of unprocessed materials, severe budget cuts, and no direct collection, there is little hope that the Arizona archivists will prioritize collecting materials from queer of color communities. However, there has been a positive changes in the state of Arizona. For example, in 2012, Dr. Jamie Lee from the University of Arizona began the Arizona Queer Archives, a community archive documenting the LGBTQIA community. The efforts made by the Arizona Queer Archives are changing Arizona statistics, but more work needs to build on these initiatives to end these cycles of underdocumentation. I received my first hands-on archival education at the Library and Archives Division at the Arizona Historical Society in Tucson, Arizona. The organization was founded on January 1884 by a group of men who called themselves the Society of Arizona Pioneers, where membership was only granted to men who had settled in the Arizona Territory before 1870. It It was later renamed the Arizona Historical Society, or AHS, and now focuses on including the histories of others in the area. Since the scope was historically narrow, there has not been a traditionally inclusive space for non-heteronormative identities. Heteronormativity is the idea that gayness is just normal, or not gayness, straightness is normal, that you just assume that everyone is straight unless proven otherwise, basically. So heteronormativity is just, it's normal to be straight. For non-heteronormative identities, it is for this reason that it is crucial to disrupt dominant notions of heteronormative practices at play within historical archival institutions. Archivists are trained to resist contextualizing historical artifacts in an effort to maintain neutrality. However, it's naive to think that processing a collection will remain an objective process. This is precisely why it is important to forego this presumption and affirm the significance of contextualizing material so as to not foreclose any interpretations. So it's very important to look at these things in context. And I think what this article is saying is that when you're archiving things, you're removing it from its context. And that can't really happen in queer archiving because queer archiving isn't really done that way, I guess. Anyway, while processing the Sarah S. Valencia collection at the Arizona Historical Society, I immediately noticed various moments of queerness. The collection has 4 linear feet, or about 8 boxes of materials ranging from personal records, genealogy, family photographs, and artifacts. The materials are in both English and Spanish, with most of the correspondence being in English. Valencia was born in Tucson, Arizona on May 4th, 1908. She also went by Sarah or Sally, depending on who she was corresponding with. She grew up close to the downtown area and attended Davies Elementary School, where she received a bilingual education. Later in life, she became a counselor and worked in the tribal communities in Arizona. She was briefly married to Ernesto Henry Parra. Religion was an important part of Valencia's life. Even in the description of her grandfather, Alcario Valencia, she writes with an emphasis in capitalization, "All my aunts and uncles and their children baptized and confirmed each other's children. And our family get together were here and later in California." She seemed to have held on to everything related to her family history, including photographs and letters until the death of her parents. While processing Valencia's letters, I came across love letters and poems from her former husband stating that he wanted them to reunite, and one of the letters was even written on a napkin. She sent him prayers in the hope that he would stop drinking, but they never remarried, and there was no evidence that she ever had a romantic relationship with anyone else. She never remarried and lived with her father until he passed away in the 1960s. There was no information about Valencia's life in the control file, where information about the donation inventory is recorded. All we know is that the materials were never claimed, and if the AHS had not taken them, they would have been thrown away. I spent the summer of 2013 reading Valencia's letters and looking through her photographs to piece her life together. The materials were donated in boxes with no identification or visible order. Included in the collection is a single black photo album with photographs dated from the 1920s. Within the pages of this album, Valencia can be seen cross-dressing. She has short hair hidden under a cap and is wearing pants with a stripe on the side and a white collar shirt and sweater. Her hands are in her pockets, and she has her mouth closed tight, and she appears to be looking down. Another photograph shows Valencia wearing the same outfit, but is standing with a friend in an endearing manner. In the third photograph, it could be argued that this pose shows Valencia about to kiss her friend. In the same album, there are also photographs of what looks to be a wedding of a couple outside of a home surrounded by rocking chairs and plants. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that Katie and Josie is written in pen in the photograph. The two women are posed in this photograph like a traditional wedding couple. It could be that this performance of a wedding is merely the two women playing dress up in a suit and wedding dress with a bouquet from the garden, but it can also be read as a queer moment or the desire to be married to another woman. Interesting. So it's my understanding that it's taking something and making another interpretation out of it. Now, this is a contention I had at first when I'm reading about queer studies, because it's like, you mean it's a lie? Like, it didn't happen, but you're saying it could have happened, and that is where queer scholarship comes in. It's just looking at it from a different point of view. Actually, I think I have a really good example of this. Let me finish here. These intimate moments are scattered in several pages of the album alongside photographs of different family members and could have easily been overlooked. Oh man, what's it called? I need to pause it here so I can find it. It's called Queering the Map is what it's called. And it starts you off in Ontario, Montreal, Canada type of area, because that is where it was, where it first began. You know what I'm saying? But every single one of these dots is a queer person putting their thoughts on here. And I found one because in the middle of the ocean, I'm looking around because it's like I can't differentiate between any of these. So like, okay, here it is. Here we go. Thomas, you have always been kind and generous, and you were so brave when the Titanic sank. You gave it your life and saved it to the people I always loved you. Now, that one doesn't really speak to the nature of queerness per se. Well, I'm not familiar with the movie Titanic, but this one screamed out to me, the one next to it. Rose, you were so beautiful here on the RMS Titanic. I couldn't believe my eyes when I first saw you. I truly hoped for the best, but alas, you were straight and fell for that poor boy Jack. After the ship sunk and we were rescued from our respective lifeboats, I never saw you again. I had only heard stories about your, unfortunately, heterosexual love. I love you, Rose. Okay, I think this is a perfect encapsulation of what queering the archive is. As far as I know, there is no record of any queer people being on the ship, but I do not know a lot about the Titanic. I will readily admit that. But the traditional story of the Titanic, as told from James Cameron's point of view from the 1990s film, is that they were straight. It was a straight couple. But what this does, it makes it interesting by saying, like, what if there was a queer person on the boat who noticed this and nothing happened out of it? So it's like making your own story with the information that's readily available. And I think that's neat. So that, I think, is a good idea of what I'm talking about, because that's what they were saying here of like, it could be that this performance of a wedding is merely playing dress up, but it is also read as a queer moment for the desire to be married to another woman. Like, if that wasn't possible at this time, which it wasn't, because gay marriage wasn't legalized until 10 years ago, you know what I mean? So, at least I think it was 10 years ago. Might have been later than that, sorry. But it's that. It's like reading between the lines. It's making a story out of something that might not have been there. That's at least my understanding of it. I hope it's right. So, let's continue on. I'm going to sip of coffee first. Delicious. This is not the only instance that lends itself to queer readings. I further closed the gaps within Valencia's life thanks to a conversation I had with a former archivist who collected the materials back in 2006. This former archivist stated that a disagreement of an unknown nature left Valencia ostracized and living alone without any contact from family until she passed away at 99 years old, much like Betty White. Kwame Holmes, 2015, alludes to the importance of gossip within the histories of queer bodies. Holmes states gossip could function as an archive on experience, even as it resists recognition and institutionalization. If there is an attempt to create linear stories within archival institutions, specifically with archivists, documenting how collections are acquired and then processed, so much will be lost. Leaving these stories out of the narrative is a disservice, especially when users access the collection and are not provided the whole story. The conversation with archivist the conversation with the archivist changed the way I look at photographs of Valencia. I read her lack of remarriage or any reference to any other relationship in her letters as something significant to add to this narrative. There needs to be an allowance for these moments to exist, and it is crucial to document them. A queer of color lens is important during the processing part of the archivist role, but it should also be considered in other parts of the position. For example, during a research consultation, the archivist or reference librarian may stumble upon materials that might not have even been cited or marked as potentially queer. This is a unique point of view because outside the original location, the archivist processing the collection will be one of very few to touch every single piece of material. The possibility that Valencia may very well have been a lesbian is not necessarily important in this sense. Rather, what's important here is reading her life as open to the possibility of queerness without presuming an identity. Valencia's cross-dressing and the other photographs break the heteronormative narratives and speaks to why it is necessary for archivists to stop assuming a neutral stance and challenge the protocols that discourage additional information in the archival process. Conclusion. It's important to incorporate a queer of color lens in processing archival materials to ensure that processing archivists do not disavow queer possibilities. The act of queering has provided the opportunity to disrupt fixed archival institutions that have the power to erase and ignore histories of those who do not fit white and heteronormative practices. Within such institutions as the Arizona Historical Society, there have been legacies of erasure of underrepresented groups and creativity is needed to reimagine what transformative spaces can look like. In this case, through a visual representation of photographs, a seemingly heterosexual woman exhibits moments of queerness that could only be uncovered through a queer of color lens. So like if they saw this photograph and they just saw two women and they just chalked it up to, like, what if the archive had said two women playing dress up, like pretending to be married? That says nothing about their desires for each other. It just says very value-free, unbiased, as being like, this is it. By having this queer of color lens, it's like, what if she were lesbian? What if there were more to the story and you're just acting like she was straight the whole time? You know what I mean? So that piece of evidence could have been looked at as just whatever. It's not like an actual wedding photo. You know what I mean? It's not like officially recognized. There's nothing that says she had any other relationships outside of that. Getting carried away. Although I did not label the manuscript collection as gay, lesbian, or queer, I considered other possibilities like adding context to the significance of those photos and Valencia's life in the historical or biographical note of finding aid. While I no longer work at the Arizona Historical Society, I've decided to revisit this collection and request to add context to the control file, as well as cross-dressing as a Library of Congress subject heading in the catalog record. So, queer archives are complex, messy, disruptive, and extremely personal because they delve into the intimacies of gender and sexuality. As Anjali Aron-Dekar et al. 2015 state, queer archives are all about the soiled and untidy, leaving your dirty chonies underwear on the kitchen table. Because queerness and racialized queerness disrupt the historical structure and organization of archives, they confront and often exceed the limitations delineated by standards and best practices. Nevertheless, a queer lens offers a more flexible approach to collecting and processing in archival institutions. Adding an access point to a record that is not traditionally read as queer allows researchers to make their own interpretations. Thus, using a queer of color lens as an analytical and practical tool in archives presents archivists with opportunities to change what accessibility looks like for underdocumented communities and researchers alike. So here are the endnotes. Not a whole lot here. Ibid means that you're just referencing the material that came before it. So like Ibid MS1467. Ibid is the Sarah S Valencia collection, referring to the thing before it, so you don't have to repeat it again. Thought I'd share that with you. Totally unnecessary. But anyway, that's it. That was my reading. That was my recording. I'm going to say thank you all for joining me if you did join me. And if not, maybe you'll join me for the next one. But I look forward to maybe doing another one. Here's Stanley. It's my cat. Anything to say, Stanley? Nothing? Nothing to add for the camera? No? Okay. Well, goodbye, everyone. And I hope you have a lovely day.